We are indeed privileged to have a panel with extraordinary eminence, knowledge, experience, and diversity to address the most formidable challenge that our country faces of distributing the vaccines to the 1.35 billion citizens. To set the foundation for our discussion, I'm going to request a friend and a great executive to share with us his point of view, and he is none other than Dr. Harish Iyer, the Senior Scientific Advisor and the country head of India for the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation. Dr. Harish Iyer, would you be kind enough to get the ball rolling? And then I will request Dr. Anjan Ray to follow him right after that. I can see Professor Anjan Ray. Dr. Ray is right there on the screen. As you all know, he is the director of the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, and he brings to us the glimpses of that great institution that has served India for more than 80 years. So Harish, please take it away.
Thank you, Devendra. Hopefully you can see my slides and hear my voice.
We can see the slide, we can hear your voice, and we can see you too.
Okay, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here. You have such a stellar panel before. I don't know whether we will be able to match it in terms of the deep experience and capacity they have. I want to start very much, in some sense, continuing the previous conversation to place on record my appreciation for what the Indian companies have brought into their pipeline. They're truly heroes in my mind, for not just for India, but also for many of the lower income countries and the lower and middle income countries. They've always been heroes. And many of the people on the panel are my personal heroes. So it's really I'm a little bit awestruck following them on this panel. I will talk a little bit about our preparedness for supply, talk a little bit about the global situation where we are. I have only 5 slides, so hopefully I will get to finish in the 10 minutes allotted to me. I want to start off by saying, where are we today? Right? We've had these fascinating new results this week and last week. Yesterday, we heard that Pfizer has a vaccine with an interim 1 week post second dose efficacy of 95%. Right? This is really the number on that slide is wrong. It's 90% was what was before. Yesterday, it became 95%. But there is a challenge. It's stored at minus 80 degrees Celsius. Right? So that's clearly a challenge for us. It has only 5 days data so far at 2 to 8 Celsius. And of course, here the doses are 2 doses, 21 days apart. Let's look at the Moderna vaccine, which has also been in the news. That has an interim efficacy data of 94.5. You could say both vaccines are at 95%. But that's stored at minus 20 Celsius. It's got 1 month stability at 2 to 8, which is what we normally use these vaccines and they are stored at. And here it's a slightly different schedule. It's 2 doses, 28 days apart. You can already start thinking about why there are issues with this if you want to use it in a country like India. The US has, the US, of course, has a lot of money. They've got a very powerful setup. They've established what it takes to put this all together. I have shown you a couple of pictures at the bottom. You're talking about ultra cold freezers, very expensive capital equipment. These need to go on planes. They're most likely, these vaccines will be single dose vaccines. It's hard to imagine that you will have a multi-dose vaccine. It'll probably be PFS, single dose. So that's my expectation. So obviously for any country, a country such as India, these companies may not have sufficient capacity upfront to supply. We know Pfizer has talked about more than 1 billion doses coming in next year, but it's hard to understand how exactly with the presentation will look for countries like India. And again, the minus to 80 degrees Celsius clearly is a big problem. So there's a manufacturing capacity limitation. Who will they supply first? And then there's, of course, a storage capacity limitation. How can we store this in India? And I think the government at this point is looking at capacities, storage capacities as -20 and -80, but I'm not sure they're very serious about the -80 certainly. Then let's not forget the Russia vaccine, the Gamaleya vaccine, which also actually showed up with the interim efficacy greater than 90%. I believe it is stored at 2 to 8 from my understanding. But this 90% data is on much fewer subjects. I think what they announced was about 20 subjects turned positive. A very, very small number of people turning positive in such a large study. The other studies have had numbers like 90 people turning positive, 150, 180 people turning positive Pfizer in their final data. So still kind of small numbers when you talk about tens of thousands. But here again, what is the complexity with this Russian vaccine? It's a two-dose schedule with two different vaccines, which means basically you have to have two different vials. One is the AD26 vector and another one is the AD5 vector. So we need to understand how will they do this, two different products in a cold chain, complexity of that. It's not clear what the long-term visibility on supply is from everything I've tried to understand from industry. But the one advantage over the previous two vaccines we saw was 2 to 8 Celsius. So when you come to the Indian manufacturers, there are two leading phase 3 contenders. The Serum's first vaccine is the Chadox vaccine. It's undergoing a phase 3 trial, probably with the idea of bridging to global data. So that's a new approach. We're trying to do a fast track approach. The Bharat Biotech's phase 3 trial is going on with the inactivated whole virion approach. And also, it's a large number of subjects. It's an expensive trial. I think they're getting support from the Indian Council for Medical Research and DBT on some of this. What are the reasons I'm excited about both these companies and many of the other companies that are also on the call? They both have a lot of experience supplying vaccines to LMICs and LICs, which is of deep interest to the Gates Foundation. Also, they're likely to know that it makes sense to make multi-dose vials and which can be stored at 2 to 8 Celsius. I want to also add that where the global data has been helpful is that it tells you now finally, hey, you can have a vaccine that works. Until now, nobody actually knew if a vaccine would work, right? We all assumed, in fact, many of the early conversations were people saying there's a 25% probability it might work, 15%. This is completely new technology. mRNA completely new, both completely new. The adenoviral vector completely new. I know there's people who've done other phase 3s and so on and so forth, but it's really actually quite a new technology. It's nothing like the pentavalent, for example. The inactivated virion approach, something similar has been done for polio, but again, it's an exciting. They have a new exciting new adjuvant which they're using in the approach that Bharat Biotech is using. And yesterday night, actually, there was a very interesting talk on what are the correlates of protection. We suspect right now it'll probably be neutralizing antibody level, but there may be other things. So now the question is, will they both, first question everybody's looking to see, will they both these companies get emergency use authorization by both DCGI and WHO? DCGI very important for India, but WHO very important for other parts of the world, which will depend undoubtedly on many of the Indian manufacturers. And of course, others are following behind quickly. There is Genova, Zydus Cadila, Aurobindo, Indian Immunologicals, BioE, which are in earlier stage trials. What are the challenges? Everybody's heard the word unprecedented many times this year. It's a very difficult situation for regulators and vaccine program officials. Many of the questions were asked already this morning in the earlier sessions. So I think it will be science and data-based trade-offs on immediate protection so that we can get people confident in the economy versus long-term protection. None of these have long-term protection data. By definition, long-term protection will take time. One of the challenges of long-term protection also is that you need placebo arms, right, to continue on to get the understanding of what's the long-term efficacy. But if the vaccine is approved, do those people on placebo arms have to be given those vaccines? Does that ruin, in quotes, the biomedical research requirement of getting, how do you get two-year data? You can only get 2-year data if people have continued on the non-vaccine arm for that equivalent period of time and accrue cases. Very complex question for regulators, ethics committees. How long will the protection? What about the new technology? The adenoviral vector, the mRNA certainly is new technology. In Bharat's case, the inactivated vaccine is somewhat understood, but what's the kind of long-term experience? What's the stability data? I know that many of the companies are keeping stability doses on, continue to keep stability, but we won't know till we are very end, close to the end of the game, whether you will have 2 year stability or not, whether you will have 3 year stability for such a vaccine. At this point, it has to be by definition a limited amount of stability. And how will the cold chain handle it? One of the things in the supply chain that was a great innovation was the use of VVMs, vaccine vial monitors, which would change color if the vaccine went to an unacceptable level outside cold chain. It seems unlikely to me that these vaccines will have a VVM on them because we don't have enough stability data to say what VVM they will fit. So that's something that important to understand. And then we also went back to the question earlier about who will get which vaccine. Right? So suppose there are 3 vaccines approved, who will get which vaccine is a key question. New technology could help to supply, strengthen some of these issues. We are talking about EVIN, which the government of India is looking at as a digital solution, and which we know already has reduced stockouts significantly for the existing UIP vaccines. It will also be used to enumerate and map residents who need to get enumerated and immunized. My last slide, of course, the public is keenly awaiting a safe and efficacious vaccine. When there is a EUA, it's important to have transparent sharing of safety and efficacy data. I'm seeing a lot on social media about distrust in other countries. I think India has one of the highest levels of trust in vaccines, but these things can spread globally, this distrust question. Are there simple operational guidelines to use? Will it be a simple operation to execute? It has to be something that's simple, training of the cadre to make sure that they're available and they can handle the supply of the vaccines at the appropriate time. Cold chain I talked about. Communication, important question. Will prominent public faces be immunized along with people at the bottom of the pyramid like healthcare workers, right? So you build confidence that people do trust it. This is the opposite of rich people who can pay lots of money getting the vaccine first. Can also prominent people get vaccine, show that they're also confident on it? And then a couple of more questions, points to consider. Ability and mechanism. I think the government is putting in place an ability to quickly investigate AEFIs that are serious in nature beyond sort of injection site pain or soreness or mild fevers. And all along, I think while we're thinking about the supply chain, we need to stay with a science-based approach while keeping the needs of the population in mind. So maybe I will stop there and over to you, back to you, Mr. Devendra.
Thank you so much, Harish. Anjan is ready to go. So Anjan, will you please take it from there? Dr. Ray?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Let me start by thanking Dr. Mishra and Dr. Iyer for already setting context with the 2 key phrases that I thought are very important to this. The first one was the phrase science-based or evidence-based distribution, and the entire vaccine program logic, which is driven on 3 fundamental issues. 1, which vaccines? 2, where must they go? And 3, how do we know that the person getting it is getting what we intended? So I like the very fact that Dr. Iyer raised the point of VVMs, because it does seem that the more stringent the storage criteria get, more important it is that there is a VVM identification for supply chain outage. Otherwise, you would have a false sense of security. And we have already seen social behavior that people today are out there without masks, without social distancing. Tomorrow, once you give them a vaccine, we can expect the behavior to amplify. Maybe you go to the next slide. Yes. So these have almost all been discussed today in the previous discussions, except for 2 items here that I see were not picked upon, so I may spend more time there. One is the supply capacity of ancillary items, and the second is a proper disposal plan for not only the ancillary items that have been used, but also the compromised stocks and post-vaccination residues. These have not been touched upon at all. So I will address them a little bit. As far as the basic ecosystem for immunization is concerned, the Indian immunization program has already demonstrated that it can be done. The scale up and ramp up of this, however, is significantly more than we have seen for any other immunization program before. And therefore, the issues will be similar to scaling up anything else. So for the moment, I'm going to give the analogy of gearing up for a Mahakumbh when one is used to just a Tirupati. That is kind of what we're trying to do. And that's why, again, even was mentioned. There is an even purposed version called CoVIN that I understand is in the works. This was presented just a couple of days ago by Dr. Vinod Paul of Niti Aayog. But let us go on to the next slide. So we don't know at this point where exactly they will fall, but we know they will fall at multiple points on this sensitivity chart. We also know, or we also believe, that the sensitivity to heat is the major concern. We don't at the moment believe the sensitivity to cold will be a problem. So if you overfreeze something, it may not be a problem except for some vaccines. Therefore, there are other things that we can do today in that -20 to +8 space that could help build capacity. So I will talk about institutional approaches to temperature management. We can do that on the next slide. Let us move on. Yeah. So here are the basic possibilities. We already see that there are no major issues in normal refrigerators, but the moment I go into the remote parts of the country, and this will interest Dr. Iyer, the reliable power supply question becomes important. So how do I produce cooling reliably when I'm down at a regional health center? So there are things we've considered as solar fridges, biofuel-driven cooling. These are options that can actually be scaled. There are a number of energy programs coming up around the country which can be dovetailed. And the issue is we get the problem out there first, we get the solution out there later. At least let us get started so that the problems are surfaced. And then wherever solutions are required, I believe we are now geared to respond to them. For instance, today, we can put up in less than a week or 10 days, a solar wind biofuel hybrid. We can put up a biogas unit. We can put up a number of things that are off grid that do not require a reliable grid power supply if it comes to push comes to shove. But as we get to much lower temperatures, the second issue comes in, what about maintenance and spares? We have talked about the supply network, but what about the supply network for keeping our deep freezers running? Now, a lot of these are today being made in India, but a lot are still imported. We have to actually put together, and we will be happy to support this from CSIR, the entire component ecosystem, a predictive component ecosystem to ensure that when something breaks down, the supply chain for that is also ready, not just the supply chain for the vaccine itself. On the transportation side, the major shortage, we already see it because we do extensive testing today, the major shortage issue is dry ice. While we will hear in the last session of the day today, I can see people like Plus Polymers already in the game, ready to present, who can do temperature stabilized transport. We must ramp up right now for all our constant temperature transport solutions. And where if ultra low transport is required, and we know we will need every solution. So if ultra low transport is required, we have to build and put in much more liquid nitrogen plants, at least centrally at the hospitals that are of importance. These are actually not as difficult as it sounds, but it does have to be planned ahead and some capital investment goes into every liquid nitrogen plant. Funnily, there is or not funnily, but by a fortuitous coincidence, there is an increasing demand right now for medical oxygen. And we have looked at the design of medical oxygen plants. There are more and more creative ones coming in the next few months. I know of a few in pipeline. And in any hospital, an AIIMS or a district hospital of sufficient capacity, you can put in a medical oxygen plant, take the reject air, which will now be rich in nitrogen, and the liquid nitrogen plant will then come in at much lower cost. So dovetailing medical oxygen and liquid nitrogen plants becomes a practical reality. You could put in the capital and then decide not to run it if push came to shove. So this also addresses this question that was asked, what happens if industry puts in a lot of capacity and then there is no demand? My recommendation is put in capacity at the point of use side, put in that capacity on capital, where the capital is relatively one time and the revenue cost is modest. And then if you don't have to run it, you just save that much recurring cost. That's a better design than a very large number of disposable units that you then have to collect, dispose, manage. But of course, there will be a minimum number of disposable units required for transportation, and the truth will lie somewhere in between or in a combination of these. Also, all the domestic components that need requirement, not just maintenance and spares, but actually big pieces like compressors, will also need more capacities in the country. And that's probably worth it, not just for the COVID situation, but for the long-term healthcare ecosystem, because whatever we put in for COVID will last us in good stead for many other pandemics and even for business as usual healthcare to come. We can go to the next slide. This is my, my Six Sigma engineer's line of thought. What can go wrong? We call it failure modes, and one can actually teach a one semester course in failure modes. But very quickly, if we look at the big ones, I'm not going to go through the ones that have been obviously talked about. The very big ones are on the right-hand side, the point of use. Typically, the production site and distribution network are largely institutionalized and will be managed. But once it gets to point of use, monitoring and control goes down. So quality of training, quality of remote monitoring, quality of reporting all become very important. And we call this the 6M thing, where we must obsessively check your manpower issues, your machine issues, methods, measurement, material, and all the uncertainties like Mother Nature, which include power outage and a cyclone and the pandemic itself, that your entire vaccination team goes down with COVID, then who gives the vaccines? So how do we build that capacity? How do we do that planning? How do we preempt the fact that somebody who could be a healthcare worker on the front line has to administer the vaccine, and therefore we must know 3 or 4 days behind what their exposures are. So do we use Arogya Setu to know that they haven't been exposed or are at some even moderate risk of exposure to somebody else? Can we also look at the training of the people who are administering the vaccine to make sure that they know when vaccine A suddenly has run out and they have to go to vaccine B, that there is a change in SOP? How does all that happen? This needs to be built into our thinking. We go to the next slide. This is one of my absolute favorite papers on things that can go wrong. A very recent paper in the International Journal of Medical Science Public Health, an Ishikawa diagram showing what causes delays and dropouts in immunization. This has not been discussed, and I want to spend a minute or two on the slides. So when I go into villages, and during the WHO smallpox eradication campaign, my father was heading the campaign in Bihar, and I was a 12-year-old who went down there to help him because he didn't have enough people. So I cycled down from Gaya to Jahanabad, 40 kilometers, and I was in the grassroots. And what it told me is this, that you can overcome everything technically, you can't overcome beliefs and social issues technically. There were people who would say, मुझे खून देने में डर लगता है, मैं बकरे का खून लाके देता हूं. So we have to overcome that line of thinking. We have to overcome disinformation that spreads via social media, where somebody will start spreading for whatever reason, whether in belief or whether in disbelief or whether for any other reason, something that says, when they inject you, you don't know what else could you be getting infected with. Okay, that is why the OPV was so successful. It was oral. It did not require intervention. So we have to overcome all of this. Now also booster doses, so lack of reminders. Migration. So you give a person a dose, but he's a migrant worker and he suddenly finds a job in the next city. He goes off. So what happens to him? All of these issues have to be considered. And because we talked about the different income strata, those who can afford it, upper class, upper middle income categories, will pay for it if they require, just as they pay for testing today if it's required. But once we get to the LMICs and LICs, we have an issue. particularly at the social individual family level, that the supply chain needs to consider. And the supply chain needs to encourage through staffing of local people. I would strongly encourage a model where we staff with local people so they can talk in local language, allay local fears, establish local concerns, and do an enormous amount of internet-based connective training in a multi-tiered manner. This is the non-technical factors that I believe will ultimately determine whether we succeed or fail as a country. We can go to the next slide, which I believe is my close to no. Yeah, these are my last slide. And apart from the integration with different initiatives, making sure that we are screening out those who don't need a vaccine and we know how to screen them out, making sure we're establishing the infrastructure, developing essential IT systems. For example, we have a small IT platform called Arogyapath, where you can actually just go in and see what medical supplies are available where. I would encourage all medical players to register on this. And it gives you a PIN code delivery system, which we eventually plan to make a GPS distance-based delivery, maybe linked with players like Google, so that you can tell where the nearest vaccine is. Or the nearest vaccine point knows where the needy populations are. How do we match that? I also think that we mustn't forget that the country has got used, particularly in the smaller towns, to scooty-based last mile deliveries for food. We must link up to scooty-based deliveries and expand that to drone-based deliveries. The faster we can get vaccine from point A to point B by methods like these, the less time the vaccine spends in transit, in uncertain transit, the better it is for all of us. The last point, which I already heard this big debate on government investments in the vaccine value, I would say it is investments for everybody. India is also painfully low on percentage investment of industry in R&D. We do see that increasing from the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, where CSIR sits. We see the number of in-house R&D units increasing progressively, so we see that number is improving. But the average in-house R&D unit outlay is still well under 1%. So there needs to be more plowback as well of mature businesses. And we can see some very clear new trends emerging. One is immunomodulators and indigenous vaccines. We've talked about the indigenous vaccines, but immunomodulators are now getting tested. PGI is testing Sepsibac, a mycobacterium species, now, even as we speak. We have to build more cohorts. CSIR will be very interested to participate in more cohorts, both from an individual sampling standpoint of view and from air and sewage sampling standpoints, where we are making considerable progress. And maybe in a future discussion, we can report these. And finally, some off-the-box thinking. I see my colleague, Dr. Chandrasekhar from Sister Institute, IICT Hyderabad, is on the attendees. And he pointed out to me that in the area of therapeutics, deuterated drugs actually have some very interesting benefits. Similarly, vaccines in D2O, which require ultra-cold storage, don't require ultra-cold storage in D2O. So maybe in this country, we could invest in deuterated drug and deuterated water vaccine reconstitutions so that the cold chain can be ameliorated or mitigated. With that, I thank you for your time and listening.
Thank you, Anjan. May I request Frank Toussaint to jump in, Rajiv Nath to jump in, and Deepak Sapra to join us as well. Now I can see them all. Let's see, I can see Rajiv Nath, the Managing Director of Hindustan Syringes and Medical Devices. I can see my good friend Frank Toussaint, the Managing Director of Biolog US Europe. And where is Deepak? Deepak Sapra, the CEO of API and other devices at Dr. Reddy's lab. So may I call upon Rajiv, who is probably India's #1 provider of syringes and other supplies, to enlighten us as to what some of these challenges are. Rajiv, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mishra. It's nice catching up with you after a couple of years. We met earlier at Hyderabad.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for this opportunity. It's a very interesting conference. I've been listening in since the morning. I wear multiple hats, so I'll be speaking as the MD of Hindustan Syringes and Medical Devices, the maker of the syringes, which is part of the campaign. I will also be speaking on behalf of Association of Indian Medical Device Industry, as the forum coordinator, and I'm also the president of the Syringes and Needle Manufacturers Association of India. So multiple hats, and then I will just take you along as to what are the challenges we've noticed in the last few months, what we've tried to communicate to the government, and how we are trying to address them in partnership with the government and internationally also outside the government. So first and foremost, in April beginning, I reached out to Dr. Ella in Hyderabad, Bharat Biotech, Mr. Pankaj Patel in Cadila, and Mr. Rajiv Dhere in Serum Institute to ask about their plans for the COVID vaccine and how they plan to package it, how they plan to deliver it. And they were very key questions for us that we had in our mind, that which of their COVID vaccinations candidates they're working upon would be intramuscular, which would be intradermal, which would be subcutaneous, which would be intranasal, and which would be oral. Because each delivery would require a different kind of syringe and maybe even a different kind of needle mechanism. So I was quite encouraged when they all told me that their primary focus currently, top of the shelf, is on intramuscular, which is the most common way of delivery of using a 0.5 ml AD syringe. Having known that encouragement, I reached out to WHO, to UNICEF, and the Government of India right in the end of April, and submitted to them that the world has about 8.5 billion people. India has 1.35 billion people. Even if 2/3 are going to be injected with the vaccination, and that time we were talking about single dose. So we quantified that we've been getting at least 900 billion syringes for India alone. And at that period of time, as HMD, we were having a capacity to produce 44 million syringes per month. That means 525 billion pieces per year, for which we were already a major supplier to UNICEF worldwide for the immunization plans. Now, immunization had become completely stuck in India and partially worldwide. Not so much in Africa, but more so in India for 3 months. So, on one hand, the government was not buying, or what they were buying or they had bought from us, they were not picking up. So we had a very peculiar position that we had more than 120 million syringes lying in stock with us, which were not being picked up by UNICEF and not being picked up by Government of India. And the big question for me was, shall we keep on producing and where do we store that? And the country and the world is not thinking about stockpiling, and tomorrow there will be vaccines available, then how will we go around doing the injections? Now, as the largest supplier worldwide, the onus was on us, like it's been on Serum Institute, that they took the big gamble, we also had to take the big gamble, and I was inspired by their initiatives. So, while, of course, I communicated to the Health Secretary, to Pharma Secretary, everybody about our concerns, and our plans that we could ramp it up from 525 billion to 800 billion by the first quarter of 2021, and then 1 billion by middle of next year. There was a limited capital available with us and a limited space available with us whereby we could ramp up this capacity. So the challenge was that post-COVID, suddenly the tap would be off. And once the tap would be off, we'd be left with a huge surplus capacity, which UNICEF, WHO, and Government of India may not be buying. So who will take care of that capacity? And if they will not be taking care of the capacity, there are no commitments, then who's going to help us with the capex? Now that's one question which has never been answered, and that's been our biggest challenge. So even though we can do it quite cost effectively, and that we wanted only about 80-90 crore rupees investments, and we were asking nothing more than a contractual supply chain commitment of 3 years' time, either from the international bodies like PATH, or from UNICEF, or from Gavi, or from Ministry of Health in India, that answer has not been given to us till date. So we could only go forward with our limited capacity risk as what we could take on as a corporate company on our own heads, and then leave it for the wise policy makers and the public healthcare experts in the various government and WHO, that when the crisis will really build up, they may come back to us. The first to come back to us was UNICEF and WHO.
Right.
And in July, August, they started talking to us. And by August, they realized the need for the stockpiling. And they released an order to us in addition to our existing order of 160 million pieces per annum. We have a 2-year LTA with them. So in addition to 160 million pieces we had to supply to them this year, they gave us an additional order of 140 million to be delivered by December. Now, we already had, I told you, 120 million in stock. On top, we have to make another 140 million.
I'd love for you to wrap up as quickly as you can. We have very limited time. We really get the picture very, very well.
Okay.
I mean, what you're doing is absolutely extraordinary.
Sure.
We understand, and we understand the capacity issues. What I'd like to do is, all day long, we've talked about vaccines coming from overseas, while 3 or 4 or 5 Indian vaccine companies are working very hard. I'd like to approach my friend Frank Toussaint in Brussels, Belgium, where in his neighborhood there is AstraZeneca, there is Oxford, there is Novavax, there is BioNTech. So, Frank, how are you going to help us with this pandemic that we face in India?
Yes, thank you very much, Devendra. Actually, that's interesting to compare where I'm located, Belgium and India, because nothing is comparable in terms of size, except I would say the vaccine industry, with the presence of GSK, Pfizer, Janssen's, Novacep manufacturing for AstraZeneca and some others. So actually, we're close in terms of challenges. And what we can learn is that we have to build more bridges, not only in the air freight industry, which is a huge challenge, maybe the challenge of a lifetime, by building capacity at airport. And I heard that Mumbai is prepared for that, but we have to really get ready in a very short time in terms of capabilities of cold chain facilities, working with government in qualification, validation for the pharma industry. What we can really do is also doing more tech transfer in terms of cold chain management. Really the capacities that's now, it is increasing. Let's take as an example vitrification, which is an opportunity for ultra frozen vaccine. And also in the capacity to getting prepared in a very short time. I remember in March, April, we developed a WFP, WHO hub in 3 days in the worst period of the pandemic. So that's also the capacity to react very shortly. But what we need is that we need also more cooperation between authorities, between all stakeholders, from the packaging, the manufacturing, the governmental, the politics, because that's a global challenge and where we have to build more bridges with all the stakeholders. So that's maybe something we can learn from each other, put every stakeholder around the industry to make it happen. And we see now that the supply chain can be a very also differentiating element. We don't talk that much about the vaccine. In the presentation of Dr. Iyer, we mentioned about the stability of the product, the capacity to store at ambient temperature during 5 days or more at 2 to 8. So on that matter, I think that these topics will continue to evolve, and we need to address the challenges, by learning and doing all together. That's really one of the solutions on the short term, because that's a new situation for all of us. So we will need to be agile by changing more altogether.
Really appreciate your viewpoint, Frank. And this conference has given us a platform where we can really cross-pollinate ideas and we can connect with each other. And I'm really hoping and praying that collaboration is going to begin from this platform that we have created today. I want to go to someone who brings a very interesting proposition, and that one is no one other than Deepak Sapra, who, as you know, is the CEO of API and Services at the Dr. Reddy's Lab. if I'm not wrong, Sputnik 5 is the vaccine being developed by Russia, and Reddy's lab is very integrally involved. Deepak, would you be kind enough to shed whatever light you can on that vaccine and how
Sure,
it's being planned? Thank you,
sure.
Deepak.
Thank you. And first of all, very grateful for inviting me to this extremely illuminating discussion. What I would like to share with the group is that we are currently working on Sputnik V. This is a collaboration between Dr. Reddy's and the Gamaleya Institute in Russia through the Russian Direct Investment Fund. Now, Sputnik V, as many of you are aware, is a vaccine based on the human adenoviral vector-based platform. There are 2 doses given 3 weeks apart. And broadly, I think the idea is to use 2 different types of adenovirus vectors. We're using the ADVAC26 and the ADVAC5 for the first and the second vaccination so that it boosts the effect of the vaccine. The other thing which is important for everyone to know is that the use of human adenoviruses as vectors is fairly safe because these viruses are the ones which cause common cold, are not novel, and have been around in the human population for thousands of years. The other thing I want to talk about the vaccine is the status currently. This is amongst the few vaccines being spoken about, the ones approaching the end of clinical trials and the start of mass production, also not just in Russia, but also on WHO's list. The ongoing post-registration trial is on. The trial is on in Russia, the phase 3. This is about 40,000 volunteers. The trials are also on in the UAE and in Belarus. The trials in India are starting very soon. This is a phase 2/3 adaptive design trial, and we expect the entire set of trials to be completed in the next few months. Now, coming to manufacturing and supplies, the manufacturing will be a combination of a product which is made in Russia and made in India. We are working out the details, but I anticipate that initially we might get a certain number of doses from Russia, while at the same time we are transferring the technology into manufacturing sites in India and ramping up our production capacities in India. The process of technology transfer is currently underway. And as we do that, we are also engaging very closely with the regulator in India and also with the manufacturing sites to accelerate the process of tech transfer. One site is currently in the middle of the tech transfer, and another site is likely to start by the end of November. The storage of this vaccine is currently at -18 degrees. That is how we have the stability. We are working on the cold chain in collaboration with key partners. And we are also working on a 2 to 8 degree version of this product, which we expect should be ready in the next couple of months. As of now, we are making sure that we are fully prepared for the -18. And from that standpoint, we are configuring the supply chain, and there's a lot of preparatory work that is underway. The process flow that we have envisaged is likely to be from the manufacturing location to our global distribution center, packing the product in insulation boxes. These insulation boxes go to reefer trucks. Secondary warehousing might be required in certain cases, depending on the distance and the logistics. And based on that, we will deliver the product to the last mile. Now, a lot of people have spoken about the logistical challenge. I just want to share a light trivia. Recently, I was reading an IATA report that to vaccinate everybody in the world for coronavirus with just 1 dose would require 8 million cargo aircraft or their equivalents in trucks and reefer containers. So this is certainly not a trivial issue, but this is an issue which we will all have to work on and which we are all working on. Before I close, there are just 2 other points I want to bring to the attention of the group. These 2 points we're working on. One of them is on manpower and training. This is something which is unique for us as an organization. So we are working on upskilling our manpower, especially those who are handling the supply chain. There are guidelines that we are creating for people to work with with products at these kind of temperatures. And the other thing which we are trying to do is that we're trying to work with some companies to handle counterfeit and vaccine packaging and bring in certain measures like serialization, geofencing of transportation. We're also talking to some people on the blockchain platform. So that's a brief about what we are doing, and I hope it gives a perspective. I'll pause here, Devendra. Happy to take any questions or clarifications. Thank you.
I think we are just running out of time, and I know Nidhi is going to shut me down. So I just want to say thank you all. We could have gone on for the rest of the day, because the question I really wanted to ask each one of you is, what is one thing that keeps you awake at night about the COVID distribution challenge? Maybe there are many things. I just want you to think about that. And maybe after this conference, we will have that discussion. Let today's event be just the beginning of a long journey and a long discussion as we deal with this great challenge that our country faces. So thank you, all of you.